There is a temple in Upper Egypt that should not exist, not in the sense that its construction was impossible, although the engineering was extraordinary, not in the sense that its purpose was unusual. It served the same gods, in the same rituals, with the same theological program as dozens of other Egyptian temples. It should not exist, because everything that has destroyed every other ancient Egyptian temple, earthquakes, floods, Christian iconoclasts, Islamic builders, European trophy hunters, and the relentless chemical warfare of the Egyptian climate, also attacked this one, and this one survived, almost entirely intact, with its roof, with its walls, with its painted surfaces, with its inscriptions, with its sanctuary, its hypostyle halls, its courtyard, its pylon, its enclosure wall. Everything that every other temple in Egypt has lost, the Temple of Edfu has kept. The Temple of Horus at Edfu is the best preserved ancient temple in Egypt. That sentence, which appears in every guidebook and every travel article about the site, is worth pausing over. Egypt has hundreds of temples, most are ruins, roofless, wall-less, reduced to stumps of columns and fragments of inscription. A few retain significant structures. Karnak has its hypostyle hall, Luxor has its colonnade, Philae has its island, but none of them is complete. None of them gives the visitor the experience of entering an intact ancient Egyptian temple, of passing through the pylon, crossing the courtyard, entering the hypostyle hall, and reaching the sanctuary in near total darkness, exactly as a priest would have done 2,000 years ago. Only Edfu does that. Only Edfu preserves the full architectural sequence, from the blinding sunlight of the forecourt to the absolute darkness of the innermost shrine, that defined the Egyptian temple experience. And the reason Edfu survives is sand, the same substance that buries, that suffocates, that erases, the same desert sand that buried the Sphinx to its neck and covered Abu Simbel to its shoulders, saved the Temple of Edfu by swallowing it whole. By the medieval period, the temple was completely buried. The sand had risen to the top of the 36-meter pylon, the tallest surviving gateway in Egypt. Houses had been built on top of the buried temple. Fields had been ploughed over its courtyards. The people of Edfu lived and worked and worshipped above a monument they did not know was there. For centuries, the temple existed in a state of suspended animation, sealed by sand, protected by ignorance, waiting in the darkness for someone to dig it out. That someone was Auguste Mariette. In 1860, the French Egyptologist, who had already discovered the Serapeum at Saqqara, arrived at Edfu and began the laborious process of clearing the sand from the temple. The excavation took years. The sand was deep. In places, more than 12 meters of accumulated debris covered the ancient floor. Houses had to be demolished, residents had to be relocated, and as the sand was removed, the temple emerged, column by column, wall by wall, relief by relief, in a condition that astonished Mariette and that continues to astonish every visitor today. The paint was still visible on the ceilings. The inscriptions were still sharp on the walls. The granite shrine in the sanctuary, the naos, the Holy of Holies, carved from a single block of grey granite, still stood in its original position, exactly where it had been placed more than 2,000 years ago. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why the Temple of Edfu was built, how it survived when every other temple was destroyed, what its walls reveal about the theology, the rituals, and the daily operations of an ancient Egyptian temple, and why its extraordinary preservation makes it not merely the best-kept temple in Egypt, but the single most important source for understanding how Egyptian religion actually worked. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Edfu, you must first understand the peculiar historical moment that produced it. The temple was not built by pharaohs. It was built by Greeks. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, ending more than a century of Persian rule and inaugurating a new era in the history of the Nile Valley. When Alexander died in 323 BC, his empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, son of Lagos, who established the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek-speaking kings and queens who would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, from 305 to 30 BC, When the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra VII, died and Egypt became a Roman province, the Ptolemies faced a fundamental problem of legitimacy. They were Greeks ruling an Egyptian population. They spoke Greek. They worshipped Greek gods. They organized their court according to Greek customs. But the population they governed, the farmers, the priests, the scribes, the craftsmen of the Nile Valley, were Egyptian. They spoke Egyptian. They worshipped Egyptian gods. They lived according to Egyptian customs. And they expected their rulers to behave like pharaohs, to build temples, to make offerings, to perform the rituals that maintained the cosmic order, to fulfill the theological obligations that Egyptian kingship had carried for 3,000 years. The Ptolemies, with remarkable political intelligence, met this expectation. They presented themselves as pharaohs. They adopted Egyptian royal titles. They were depicted on temple walls in the traditional pose of the Egyptian king, wearing the double crown, making offerings to the gods, performing the rituals of divine kingship. They built temples, dozens of them, across the length of Egypt in the traditional Egyptian style, dedicated to Egyptian gods, decorated with Egyptian reliefs, inscribed with Egyptian hieroglyphs. The temple-building program of the Ptolemaic dynasty was the most extensive in Egyptian history since the New Kingdom, a deliberate, sustained, and enormously expensive campaign of architectural patronage designed to win the loyalty of the Egyptian priesthood, and, through the priesthood, the loyalty of the Egyptian people. The Temple of Edfu was the centerpiece of this program. Construction began on the 23rd of August, 237 BC, a date that is recorded with unusual precision on the temple walls during the reign of Ptolemy III Euergetes. The foundations ceremony was performed according to ancient Egyptian ritual, the king stretching a cord to define the temple's axis, digging the first trench, laying the first brick. The date was chosen by the priests for its astrological significance, and the temple that would rise on this foundation would take nearly 180 years to complete, passing through the reigns of 6 Ptolemaic kings before the final decorations were added. Under Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's father in 57 BC, 180 years, the construction of Edfu spanned almost the entire Ptolemaic period. It outlasted individual reigns, individual architects, individual generations of workers. The temple was a multi-generational project, begun by one king, continued by his son, expanded by his grandson, decorated by his great-grandson, and completed by rulers who were separated from the founder by 6 generations and nearly 2 centuries. The continuity is remarkable. Despite changes of reign, occasional civil wars, and the constant political turbulence of the late Ptolemaic period, the construction Edfu continued without significant interruption. Each new king added to the work of his predecessors. None of them altered the fundamental plan. The temple grew steadily, consistently, from foundation to completion over 180 years. The result is a building of extraordinary coherence. Unlike Karnak, which grew organically over 2,000 years and shows the stylistic variations of dozens of different builders, Edfu was built to a single plan, a unified architectural vision, executed over time but consistent in its proportions, its decorative program, and its theological content. The temple measures 137 meters in length, 79 meters in width, and 36 meters in height at the pylon. It covers an area of roughly 7,000 square meters. It is the second largest temple in Egypt after Karnak, but unlike Karnak, it is complete. Every wall is intact. Every doorway is in place. Every corridor leads where it was designed to lead. The temple is, in architectural terms, finished. The plan follows the standard Egyptian temple layout, a layout that had been refined over 3,000 years and that the Ptolemaic builders adopted with scrupulous fidelity. The entrance is through the Great Pylon, a massive trapezoidal gateway, 36 meters high, the tallest surviving pylon in Egypt. Beyond the pylon lies the open courtyard, surrounded by colonnades on 3 sides, with columns topped by a variety of floral capitals that are characteristic of Ptolemaic architecture. Beyond the courtyard stands the first hypostyle hall, the pronaos, with 18 columns arranged in 3 rows, their capitals carved in the form of elaborate botanical composites, palm leaves, lotus flowers, papyrus bundles, no two exactly alike. Beyond the pronaos lies the second hypostyle hall, smaller, darker, with 12 columns supporting a roof that admits no natural light. And beyond the second hall lies the sanctuary, the innermost chamber, the holiest space, the room that housed the sacred statue of Horus, and that was accessible only to the high priest and the king. The sanctuary contains the oldest object in the temple, the naos, the granite shrine that held the cult statue of Horus. The naos is carved from a single block of grey granite, standing roughly 4 meters tall, polished to a mirror finish, inscribed with the cartouche of Nectanebo II, the last native Egyptian pharaoh who ruled in the 4th century BC, nearly a century before the Ptolemies began construction of the current temple. The naos predates the temple. It was the one element that the Ptolemaic builders preserved from the earlier structure. The sacred container, the dwelling of the god, the object around which the entire temple was constructed. The Ptolemies demolished of the old temple and built a new one, but they kept the naos. The god's home was non-negotiable. The inscriptions that cover the walls of Edfu are among the most extensive in the ancient world. Every surface, interior and exterior, wall and column, doorway and ceiling, is covered with hieroglyphic text and carved relief. The total area of inscribed surface has been estimated at more than 3,000 square meters, the equivalent of roughly half a football pitch, covered from edge to edge with hieroglyphs. The texts include ritual prescriptions, hymns, mythological narratives, astronomical observations, construction records, and detailed descriptions of the temple's daily operations. The inscriptions at Edfu are, collectively, the most comprehensive written record of ancient Egyptian temple practice that survives from any period. They are a library in stone, a complete manual for the operation of an Egyptian temple, carved on the walls of the building they describe. The French Egyptologist Émile Chassenat spent 40 years, from 1892 to 1934, copying and publishing the inscriptions of Edfu. His publication, in 14 monumental volumes, remains the standard reference for scholars working on the temple. The sheer scale of Chassenat's achievement, 4 decades of sustained epigraphic work, producing thousands of pages of hieroglyphic transcription and translation, is itself a monument to human persistence, and even Chassenat's work is not complete. The inscriptions continue to be studied, reinterpreted, and published by new generations of scholars who find in the walls of Edfu information that previous generations overlooked or misunderstood. The political significance of the Ptolemaic temple building program, and of Edfu in particular, extends far beyond the simple equation of legitimacy through construction. The temples served as the institutional infrastructure of the Egyptian priesthood, which was, in effect, the native Egyptian governing class. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt through a dual system, a Greek administrative apparatus that managed the military, the treasury, and foreign policy, and an Egyptian priestly hierarchy that managed religion, local governance, and the cultural life of the Egyptian population. The temples were the nodes of this priestly hierarchy. They were not merely religious buildings. They were administrative centers, economic enterprises, educational institutions, and social welfare organizations. The priest of a major temple like Edfu was not just a religious official. He was a governor, a tax collector, a judge, an employer, and a community leader. The economic power of the temples was substantial. The Temple of Edfu controlled agricultural estates that produced grain, flax, and other commodities. It employed farmers, craftsmen, scribes, and laborers. It maintained workshops that produced everything from linen garments to bronze implements. It operated a treasury that collected taxes, made loans, and managed investments. The temple was, in modern terms, a vertically integrated corporation, producing, processing, and distributing goods within a single institutional framework. And the profits of this operation, the surplus grain, the excess production, the accumulated wealth, were used not for personal enrichment but for the maintenance of the temple, the support of the priesthood, and the provision of festivals that distributed food and drink to the local population. This economic model, temple as economic institution, was not new. It had been operating in Egypt since the Old Kingdom, more than 2,000 years before the Ptolemies. But the Ptolemies formalized it, rationalized it, and expanded it to an unprecedented degree. The Ptolemaic temples were not merely religious monuments built by the state. They were economic engines, designed to integrate the Egyptian population into the Ptolemaic economic system through the familiar and trusted institution of the temple. By building temples, the Ptolemies were not merely buying legitimacy, they were building infrastructure, the administrative infrastructure of a colonial state disguised as religious architecture. Edfu's inscriptions provide the most detailed surviving record of how this economic system operated. The texts on the walls include inventories of the temple's possessions, lists of agricultural estates, workshops, and storerooms. They include records of the temple's income, the quantities of grain, oil, wine, and other commodities received from the estates. They include records of the temple's expenditures, the quantities of food, incense, and other materials consumed in the daily rituals and the annual festivals. And they include records of the temple's personnel, the names and titles of the priests, the scribes, the craftsmen, and the laborers who served the temple. These records, carved in hieroglyphs on the walls of the temple, are the ancient Egyptian equivalent of an annual report, a comprehensive account of the institution's financial operations, published in permanent form on the walls of the building it describes. No modern corporation publishes its annual report in stone, but the Temple of Edfu does, and the report has been available for consultation by anyone who can read hieroglyphs for more than 2,000 years. The inscriptions at Edfu also provide detailed information about the construction of the temple itself, information that is available nowhere else in Egyptian archaeology. The building texts, carved on the outer face of the enclosure wall, record the dates of each phase of construction, the names of the kings under whom each phase was completed, and the dimensions of each element of the building. These texts allow scholars to reconstruct, with considerable precision, the sequence in which the temple was built, which rooms were completed first, which decorative programs were added when, and which kings were responsible for which portions of the work. The construction sequence, as revealed by the building texts, proceeded from the inside out. The sanctuary, the holiest space, the dwelling of the god, was completed first. The surrounding chambers were added next. The hypostyle halls followed. The courtyard was built after the halls. And the pylon, the entrance gateway, the most visible element of the temple, was completed last. This inside-out sequence is the reverse of what a modern builder would do. A modern builder starts with the exterior, the facade, the entrance, the public face, and works inward. The Egyptian builders started with the sacred core and worked outward. The reason is theological. The god needs his dwelling, for the worshippers need their entrance. The sacred takes priority over the functional. The inside is more important than the outside. This construction sequence also means that the oldest decorated surfaces at F are the innermost ones, the sanctuary, the surrounding chambers, the inner hypostyle hall, while the newest are the outermost, the courtyard, the pylon, the enclosure wall. The visitor who walks from the pylon to the sanctuary is walking backward through the construction sequence, from the newest to the oldest, from the last king's work to the first king's work, from Ptolemy XII to Ptolemy III. The journey inward is also a journey backward in time, a physical progression through 180 years of construction history compressed into 137 meters of architectural space. The astronomical texts at Edfu are another dimension of the temple's encyclopedic inscriptions. The ceiling of the pronaos, the first hypostyle hall, is decorated with an astronomical chart that depicts the constellations, the planets, and the hours of the night. The chart is not merely decorative, it is functional, a practical guide to the night sky, designed to assist the priests in determining the correct timing for nocturnal rituals. The priests of Edfu, like all Egyptian priests, were required to perform certain rituals at specific hours of the night, and the determination of those hours required the observation of specific stars and constellations as they rose, transited, and set. The astronomical ceiling was their reference, their star chart, their clock, painted on the ceiling of the hall where they gathered before proceeding to the sanctuary for the pre-dawn ritual. The myth of Horus and Seth, inscribed on the walls of the inner corridor, is the theological backbone of the temple's entire program. The myth tells the story of cosmic conflict, the battle between Horus, the god of order, and Seth, the god of chaos, for control of the throne of Egypt. The battle is long, violent, and episodic, involving physical combat, magical contests, legal arguments before the divine tribunal, and, ultimately, the victory of Horus and his installation as the legitimate king of Egypt. The myth is not merely a story, it is a constitutional document, the theological justification for the institution of kingship, the narrative that explains why the pharaoh rules, why order must prevail over chaos, and why the daily rituals of the temple are necessary to maintain the cosmic balance. At Edfu, the myth is not merely recorded, it is performed. The Festival of Victory, celebrated annually, reenacted the myth in dramatic form, with priests playing the roles of the gods, wearing masks and costumes, wielding ritual weapons, and performing the battle of Horus and Seth before an audience of worshippers. The festival included the ritual slaughter of a hippopotamus, Seth's animal form, represented by a model that was harpooned, dismembered, and consumed as part of the celebration. The texts that describe the festival include dialogue, the words spoken by each character, the stage directions for each scene, the cues for the music and the movement. They are, in the fullest sense, a theatrical script, the oldest surviving example of scripted drama in the world. The implications of this for the history of theatre are significant. The Western tradition traces the origins of drama to the Greek Dionysia, the festival of Dionysus at Athens, where the first tragedies were performed in the 6th century BC. But the Festival of Victory at Edfu predates the Dionysia by at least 2 centuries, and the tradition it represents may be considerably older, stretching back to the New Kingdom or even the Old Kingdom. If the Edfu texts preserve a dramatic tradition that antedates the Greek one, then the origins of theatre may need to be relocated, from Athens to the Nile Valley, from the 6th century BC to the 3rd millennium BC, from the Western tradition to the Egyptian. The claim is provocative and not universally accepted. Some scholars argue that the Edfu texts are not truly dramatic, that they are ritual prescriptions rather than theatrical scripts, and that the performance they describe was liturgical rather than artistic. The distinction is valid but narrow. A ritual drama is still a drama. It has characters, dialogue, action, conflict, and resolution. It is performed by actors before an audience. It tells a story. And the story, the battle of Horus and Seth, the victory of order over chaos, is one of the most compelling narratives in Egyptian mythology. Whether we call it theatre or ritual, the fact remains that the Temple of Edfu contains the oldest surviving script for a performed narrative in the world, and the script is still readable, still on the walls, still waiting to be performed. The site of Edfu was sacred long before the Ptolemies built their temple. Archaeological evidence indicates that a temple existed at the location during the New Kingdom, roughly 1400 to 1200 BC, under the reigns of Ramesses I, Seti I, and Ramesses II. Fragments of New Kingdom masonry, inscribed with the cartouches of these pharaohs, were discovered embedded in the foundations of the Ptolemaic structure and in the surrounding debris. The Ptolemaic builders did not construct on virgin ground. They demolished the older temple and built their new one on the same sacred site, preserving the location while replacing the building. This practice of building on the site of an earlier temple was standard in Egyptian architecture. Sacred locations were believed to possess an inherent holiness that was independent of the physical structure built upon them. The holiness was in the ground, not in the building. When a building deteriorated or became too small for its expanding cult, it could be demolished and replaced without any loss of sacredness. The new building inherited the holiness of the site and, by association, the holiness of the destroyed predecessor. The Ptolemaic temple at Edfu was therefore not merely a new building. It was the latest incarnation of a sacred tradition that stretched back at least 1,000 years before its construction began. The god Horus, to whom the temple was dedicated, was one of the most ancient and most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Horus, the falcon god of the sky, the protector of the king, the avenger of his father Osiris, was worshipped throughout Egypt from the earliest periods of Egyptian history. At Edfu, Horus was worshipped specifically as Horus the Beditite. Horus of Bedet, referring to the ancient name of the city. In this form, Horus was a warrior god, a defender of cosmic order, a slayer of the forces of chaos, a protector of the righteous. The falcon-headed figure that dominates the temple's iconography, standing, seated, wearing the double crown, holding the crook and flail, is Horus in his role as divine king, the model for all earthly kings, the prototype of pharaonic authority. The mythology of Horus, as inscribed on the walls of Edfu, is the most complete account of the Horus myth that survives from antiquity. The myth centers on the conflict between Horus and his uncle Seth, the god of disorder, violence, and the desert, for the throne of Egypt. The conflict begins with the murder of Osiris by Seth, a foundational crime that disrupts the cosmic order, and that can only be resolved by the victory of Horus, Osiris's son, over his father's murderer. The battle is long, episodic, and violent, involving physical combat, magical transformation, legal arguments before the divine tribunal, and a series of contests that test the fitness of each contender for the throne. The Edfu inscriptions present the most elaborate version of this myth, a version that includes episodes not found in earlier sources, and that integrates the myth into the liturgical program of the temple through the annual Festival of Victory. The festival transformed the myth from a narrative into an experience, from a story told in text and relief to a drama performed in real time, with real actors, real props, real weapons, and a real audience that participated in the cosmic victory through their presence and their prayers. The figure of Horus that stands in the courtyard of the temple, a large granite statue of the falcon god, roughly 3 meters tall, wearing the double crown, is one of the most photographed objects in Egyptian archaeology. The statue stands at the entrance to the first hypostyle hall, flanking the doorway, its polished granite surface reflecting the sunlight, its falcon eyes staring forward with an expression of calm, absolute authority. The statue is not merely decorative, it is apotropaic, a guardian figure, designed to protect the temple from malign forces, to ward off the enemies of order, to prevent the forces of chaos from entering the sacred space. Every visitor who passes through the doorway passes under the gaze of Horus, and the gaze, carved in granite, has been maintaining its vigil for more than 2,000 years. A second, smaller granite falcon stands inside the temple, near the entrance to the sanctuary. This falcon, also finely carved and polished, wears the double crown and stands on a pedestal inscribed with Ptolemaic cartouches. Together, the two falcons, one at the entrance to the hypostyle hall, one at the entrance to the sanctuary, define the processional axis of the temple. They are waypoints on the journey from the profane to the sacred, from the world outside to the dwelling of the god. The visitor passes the first falcon and enters the temple. The visitor passes the second falcon and approaches the sanctuary. Each falcon marks a threshold, a point of transition, a boundary between one level of sanctity and the next. The Nilometer at Edfu, a staircase descending to the level of the Nile, inscribed with measurement marks, provided the priests with information about the height of the annual flood. The Nile flood was the most important economic event in the Egyptian calendar. The flood determined whether the harvest would be abundant or meager, whether the population would prosper or starve. The Nilometer allowed the priests to predict the flood level and to adjust their ritual and administrative activities accordingly. A high flood required different rituals than a low flood. A high flood was a sign of divine favor. A low flood was a sign of divine displeasure. The Nilometer was, in effect, a divine thermometer, a tool for measuring the mood of the gods, based on the height of the water. The enclosure wall of the temple, which surrounds the entire complex, is one of the most complete examples of a temple temenos wall in Egypt. The wall is massive, roughly 10 meters high and several meters thick, built of sandstone blocks laid in regular courses. The interior face of the wall is decorated with reliefs and inscriptions, including the continuous narrative of the Horus and Seth myth that runs along the outer ambulatory corridor. The wall served multiple functions. It defined the sacred space of the temple, separating the holy from the profane. It protected the temple from unauthorized entry. It shielded the interior from the noise and activity of the surrounding town, and it symbolized the boundary between order and chaos, the cosmic wall that separated the created world from the formless void. The space between the temple proper and the enclosure wall, the ambulatory corridor, was used for specific rituals that required circling the temple. The procession of the bark of Horus around the exterior of the building during certain festivals was a ritual circumambulation, a sacred walk that activated the protective power of the enclosure wall and that reinforced the boundary between order and chaos. The reliefs on the interior face of the wall, the scenes of Horus defeating Seth, were the visual accompaniment to this circumambulation. As the procession moved around the building, the myth unfolded on the walls beside them, scene by scene, episode by episode, victory by victory, until the procession returned to its starting point and the myth reached its conclusion. The circumambulation was, in architectural terms, a narrative experience, a story told in space and time through the physical act of walking around a building. The story was the myth, the building was the book, and the walking was the reading. Each step advanced the narrative, each turn of the corridor revealed a new episode, and the completion of the circuit, the return to the starting point, signified the completion of the myth and the restoration of cosmic order. This integration of narrative, architecture, and movement is one of the most sophisticated features of the Temple of Edfu, and one of the most difficult for modern visitors to appreciate since the circumambulation ritual is no longer performed. But the walls are still there, the reliefs are still in sequence, the corridor is still walkable, and anyone who walks the full circuit of the temple, reading the reliefs as they go, experiences the myth of Horus and Seth in the way it was designed to be experienced, not as a text on a page, but as a story in a building, unfolding with each step, surrounding the reader on all sides, carved in the same stone that forms the walls of the corridor and the floor beneath the feet. The core problem of the Temple of Edfu is the problem of preservation itself. Why did this temple survive when every other temple in Egypt was damaged or destroyed? The answer involves a combination of geology, geography, climate, and human forgetfulness that is unique to this site. The first factor is sand. The Nile Valley at Edfu is narrow. The cultivation extends only a short distance from the river before giving way to the desert. The temple, located on the western edge of the town, was positioned close to the desert margin, where wind-blown sand accumulated rapidly. As the temple fell out of use, after the Christian closure of pagan temples in the 4th century of the Common Era, the sand began to drift against the walls. Within a few centuries, the lower portions of the building were buried. Within a millennium, the entire structure was covered. Pylon, courtyard, hypostyle halls, sanctuary, all of it entombed in sand and silt. The burial was not uniform. The sand accumulated fastest against the leeward walls, where wind eddies deposited their load. The courtyard, an enclosed space that trapped windborne material, filled more quickly than the exterior, and the interior chambers, the hypostyle halls and the sanctuary, were sealed by the collapsing rubble of doorways and roofing stones, creating enclosed spaces that were effectively airtight. The paint on the ceiling of the first hypostyle hall, the pronaos, survived because the sand sealed the room before the paint could fade. The inscriptions on the inner walls survived because they were never exposed to rain, wind, or the temperature fluctuations that destroy carved sandstone surfaces over time. But sand alone does not explain Edfu's preservation. Other temples were also buried: the Temple of Dendera, the Temple of Kom Ombo, portions of Karnak. None of them survived as completely as Edfu. The additional factor at Edfu was the Christian conversion. When the Roman Empire adopted Christianity and ordered the closure of pagan temples, the Christians at Edfu, like Christians throughout Egypt, defaced the pagan reliefs, chipping away the faces of the gods and the cartouches of the pharaohs to prevent their use as objects of worship. This defacement is visible at Edfu. Many of the figures on the exterior walls have had their faces removed, and some of the cartouches have been chiseled away. But the defacement was limited to the surfaces that were accessible. By the time the Christians arrived, the lower portions of the temple were already buried. The reliefs that were below the sand line were untouched, sealed, protected, invisible. The Christians could only deface what they could see, and what they could see by the 4th or 5th century was only the upper portions of the pylon and the tops of the courtyard walls. Everything below, the hypostyle halls, the sanctuary, the interior chambers, was already buried. The sand had saved them. And it gets worse, or rather, more extraordinary. The fact that houses were built on top of the buried temple actually contributed to its preservation. The weight of the houses compacted the sand, creating a stable fill that prevented the sand from shifting and potentially collapsing the buried chambers. The houses also covered the temple with an additional layer of debris, mud brick, domestic waste, ash, that added another layer of insulation against the elements. The people of Edfu, living on top of a buried temple they did not know existed, were inadvertently protecting the monument that lay beneath their feet. Mariette's excavation, beginning in 1860, reversed this process. The sand was removed, the houses were demolished, the temple emerged from its burial, blinking in the sunlight for the first time in more than a millennium. And the condition in which it emerged was, by the standards of Egyptian archaeology, miraculous. The walls were intact, the roof was intact, the columns were standing, the inscriptions were legible, the paint in the interior chambers was still vivid, the naos was still in the sanctuary, exactly where it had been placed 2,000 years earlier. Edfu was not a ruin, it was a preserved building, a time capsule, sealed by sand and opened by Mariette, containing within its walls the most complete record of ancient Egyptian temple life that has ever been found. The implications of this preservation for our understanding of Egyptian religion are enormous. Most of what we know about Egyptian temple ritual comes from fragmentary sources. A papyrus here, a broken relief there, an inscription on a wall that has lost its context. At Edfu, the context is intact. The inscriptions are in their original positions. The reliefs are on their original walls. The rooms are in their original sequence. And the texts describe in exhaustive detail the rituals that were performed in the very rooms where the texts are carved. The description and the setting are one. The manual and the machine are the same object. This is unprecedented. No other Egyptian temple provides this kind of integrated, contextualized, site-specific documentation of its own ritual program. The daily ritual at Edfu is described in a series of inscriptions on the walls of the sanctuary and the surrounding chambers. The ritual followed a sequence that was ancient, fundamentally unchanged since the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years before the Ptolemaic builders inscribed it at Edfu. Before dawn, the officiating priest would purify himself, enter the temple, light the torches, and proceed to the sanctuary. He would break the clay seal on the shrine doors, open the doors, and reveal the sacred statue of Horus, a small golden figure, probably less than a meter tall, draped in linen and adorned with jewels. The priest would prostrate himself. He would then wash the statue, anoint it with sacred oils, dress it in fresh linen, apply kohl to its eyes, and present offerings of food, flowers, and incense. The offerings were placed on an altar in front of the naos. The incense was burned in a bronze censer, the hymns were chanted, and then, at the conclusion of the ritual, the priest would close the shrine doors, reseal them with fresh clay, and withdraw, sweeping his footprints from the floor as he left. This ritual was performed every day, without exception, for the entire period that the temple was active, roughly 300 years, from the completion of the sanctuary to the Christian closure. The cumulative number of performances, roughly 110,000 mornings, is a testament to the institutional persistence of the Egyptian priesthood under Ptolemaic and Roman rule. The Greeks conquered Egypt. The Romans conquered the Greeks. But the priests of Horus at Edfu continued to perform their daily ritual in their traditional manner, using their traditional texts. In a temple built by foreign kings for 3 centuries, the ritual outlasted empires, and the texts that describe the ritual outlasted the ritual. The inscriptions are still on the walls, the descriptions are still legible, the sequence of actions, purification, entry, unveiling, washing, anointing, dressing, offering, sealing, withdrawal, can still be read, in hieroglyphic Egyptian, on the sandstone walls of the sanctuary. A modern Egyptologist, with knowledge of hieroglyphs and a good flashlight, can stand in the sanctuary at Edfu and read the instructions for a ritual that was performed daily for 300 years. And that ceased 17 centuries ago. The priest is gone, the manual remains. The comparison between Edfu and other Ptolemaic temples illuminates what makes this particular building unique. The Temple of Dendera, dedicated to Hathor and located 165 kilometers north of Edfu, is also well preserved. Its roof is intact, its hypostyle hall is largely complete, and its famous zodiac ceiling is one of the most photographed objects in Egyptian archaeology. But Dendera's courtyard was never completed, its pylon was never built, and portions of its exterior decoration were left unfinished. The Temple of Komombo, located between Edfu and Aswan, is a fascinating double temple, two parallel sanctuaries dedicated to two gods, but it has lost much of its structure to earthquakes and river erosion, and significant portions of its walls have collapsed. The Temple of Philae, relocated to its current island location during the Aswan Dam salvage campaign, is atmospheric and beautiful but incomplete, with significant portions of its decorated surfaces damaged by water and by the Christian conversion. Edfu surpasses all of these. It is more complete than Dendera. It is better preserved than Komombo. It is more intact than Philae. It is, by any metric of structural and decorative preservation, the most complete ancient Egyptian temple that survives. And its completeness is not merely architectural, it is textual. The inscriptions at Edfu are more extensive, more detailed, and more varied than those at any other Ptolemaic temple. They constitute, in the words of the Egyptologist Dieter Kurth, who has devoted decades to their study and translation, the most important single source for the religion of the later periods of ancient Egypt. Kurth's assessment is based on the sheer volume and variety of the texts. The inscriptions at Edfu include ritual prescriptions for every major festival in the temple's calendar. They include hymns to Horus in multiple forms, as Horus the Beditite, as Horus the Avenger, as Horus the Uniter of the Two Lands. They include mythological narratives, not just the myth of Horus and Seth, but also creation narratives, genealogies of the gods, and cosmological treatises that describe the structure and origin of the universe. They include administrative records, inventories, accounts, lists of personnel. They include architectural texts, descriptions of the temple's dimensions, its construction sequence, its decorative program, and they include what might be called philosophical texts, meditations on the nature of the divine, the purpose of ritual, and the relationship between the human and the cosmic. The diversity of these texts is itself significant. It tells us that the priests of Edfu were not mere ritualists, men who performed the same actions every day without thought or variation. They were intellectuals, theologians, mythographers, historians, administrators, and in some cases, chemists and astronomers. The temple was not merely a place of worship. It was a center of learning, a university in the broadest sense, where knowledge was generated, preserved, and transmitted from one generation of priests to the next. The library of the Temple of Edfu, a small room located to the right of the entrance to the second hypostyle hall, provides direct evidence of this intellectual activity. The walls of the library are inscribed with a catalogue of the books that were once stored there. Titles of papyrus scrolls covering subjects including ritual practice, mythology, astronomy, geography, and temple administration. The scrolls themselves are long gone. Papyrus does not survive for 2,000 years, even in the dry Egyptian climate. But the catalogue remains. A table of contents for a library that has been destroyed. A ghost index of books that no one will ever read again. The catalogue includes titles that are tantalizing in their specificity. The Book of the Temple's Festivals, the Book of the Protection of the God's Image, Knowledge of the Periodic Returns of the Two Stars, the Book of Apprehending the Enemies, the Inventory of What is in the Temple. Each title suggests a specialist text, a detailed treatment of a specific topic, written by a priest scholar for the use of his colleagues and successors. The texts were practical, not abstract philosophy but operational guides, designed to be used in the daily management of the temple and its rituals. They were the textbooks of the Edfu Theological School, and the catalogue, carved on the library wall, is the syllabus. The loss of these texts is incalculable. If even a fraction of the scrolls listed in the Edfu catalogue had survived, our understanding of Egyptian religion, astronomy, and intellectual life would be transformed. But they have not survived. The papyrus rotted, the scrolls crumbled, the ink faded, and the catalogue, The stone record of what was once there is all that remains. The catalogue is a monument to loss, a permanent record of a temporary archive, a stone shelf that once held paper books, a memorial to the fragility of knowledge in the face of time. But the catalogue is also a monument to ambition. The priests of Edfu did not merely perform rituals. They wrote books, they maintained a library, they catalogued their knowledge. They tried, with the tools available to them, to preserve their intellectual heritage against the ravages of time. They chose papyrus, the best material available for flexible, portable written records, and they stored their scrolls in a dedicated room, inscribed the catalogue on the walls, and hoped that the combination of papyrus and stone would preserve their knowledge for future generations. The papyrus failed, the stone survived, and the catalogue, inscribed in hieroglyphs on the wall of a small room in the back of the temple, has outlasted the books it indexed by 2,000 years. The lesson is the same lesson that every ancient monument teaches. Stone outlasts paper. Architecture outlasts text. The container outlasts the content. And the content, the actual knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of priestly scholarship, is gone. What remains is the container, the shelf, the catalogue, the empty library, the stone monument to knowledge lost. The daily operations of the Temple of Edfu are described in such detail that modern scholars have been able to reconstruct, hour by hour, the typical day of an Edfu priest. The day began before dawn, with ritual purification in the sacred well, a water source located within the temple compound, used exclusively for the preparation of the priests for their sacred duties. The purification involved bathing, shaving, and the application of sacred ointments. The priest then dressed in white linen, the only material considered ritually pure, and proceeded to the temple. The first task was the lighting of the torches. The temple interior was windowless. The only natural light entered through narrow slits in the walls and ceiling, which admitted thin beams that illuminated specific surfaces at specific times of day. The rest of the interior was dark. The torches, carried by the priests and placed in wall brackets, provided the only consistent light. The flickering of the torchlight on the carved and painted surfaces would have created an atmosphere of extraordinary drama, the gods appearing and disappearing as the flames moved, the hieroglyphs emerging and receding as the shadows shifted, the entire interior pulsing with a light that was alive, unstable, and mysterious. The incense was prepared in the laboratory, the small room whose walls contained the sacred recipes. The ingredients were measured, ground, and mixed according to the prescriptions. The most complex preparation, kifi, required several days of work. Simpler mixtures could be prepared in a few hours. The incense was burned in bronze censers. Handheld containers with chains, swung by the priest as he moved through the temple, filling the corridors with fragrant smoke that was understood to be the breath of the god, the visible presence of the divine in the physical world. The daily offering was placed on the altar before the naos. The offering typically included bread, beer, wine, fruit, vegetables, meat, and flowers, a complete meal presented to the god as sustenance for his ka. The offering was not consumed by the god in the physical sense. The food was later distributed to the priests and temple personnel as part of their compensation. But the spiritual essence of the food, the invisible, intangible quality that distinguished offered food from ordinary food, was consumed by the god, sustaining his divine energy and maintaining his presence in the physical world. The evening ritual was briefer than the morning one. The shrine was not reopened. The statue was not rewashed. Instead, the priest performed a series of protective rituals, spells and gestures designed to guard the temple and its god through the dangerous hours of the night, when the forces of chaos were at their strongest. The torches were extinguished, the doors were sealed, and the temple was left in darkness, the god alone in his shrine, the sanctuary silent, the building sleeping until the next dawn and the next breaking of the seal. This cycle, dawn awakening, morning ritual, daily offering, evening protection, night rest, was repeated every day without exception for the entire period that the temple was active. The cycle was not merely routine, it was cosmic. The daily ritual of the priest mirrored the daily cycle of the sun, rising at dawn, traversing the sky, setting at dusk, passing through the underworld at night, and rising again at dawn. the priest's actions were not merely human actions. They were cosmic actions, human contributions to the maintenance of the cosmic order, essential components of the mechanism that kept the universe running. And the mechanism ran for 300 years at Edfu. 300 years of daily dawns, daily rituals, daily offerings, daily protections, roughly 110,000 mornings, 110,000 breakings of the seal, 110,000 washings of the golden face. The accumulation of daily practice, repeated without exception for 3 centuries, is a testament to institutional persistence that few modern institutions can match. The passage between the outer and inner hypostyle halls at Edfu contains 2 small rooms that are among the most unusual features of any Egyptian temple. One is the already mentioned laboratory, with its chemical recipes inscribed on the walls. The other is the treasure room, a chamber whose walls list the precious objects stored within the temple: gold, silver, precious stones, sacred oils, fine linens, and ritual implements. The list is not merely an inventory. It is a consecrated record. Each item is described with its theological significance, its ritual function, and its position within the temple's sacred economy. The gold is not merely gold, it is the flesh of the gods. The silver is not merely silver, it is the bones of the gods. The linen is not merely fabric, it is the skin of the divine body. This theological coding of material objects, the transformation of ordinary substances into divine substances through the assignment of theological meaning, is one of the most distinctive features of Egyptian temple culture. At Edfu, the coding is explicit and comprehensive. Every material used in the temple's rituals is assigned a divine identity. Every substance is linked to a body part of the gods. Every object is simultaneously physical and metaphysical, a thing of the world and a thing of the cosmos. The temple does not merely contain objects, it transforms them. It converts the profane into the sacred through the power of ritual and the assignment of theological meaning. The festival calendar, inscribed on the exterior wall of the temple, provides the most complete surviving record of an Egyptian temple's annual ritual schedule. The calendar lists every festival celebrated at Edfu, more than 40 separate events spread across the 12 months of the Egyptian year. Each entry specifies the date, the name of the festival, the rituals to be performed, the offerings to be made, and the participants required. The calendar is, in modern terms, a scheduling document, a year-at-a-glance overview of the temple's operational program, carved in stone on the wall of the building it governed. The festivals ranged from modest daily observations to elaborate multi-day celebrations. The smallest festivals involved only the officiating priest and a limited set of rituals. The largest, the Festival of the Beautiful Meeting, the Festival of Victory, and the New Year Festival, involved the entire temple staff, the local population, and, in some cases, visiting delegations from other temples. The variety of the calendar, its inclusion of agricultural festivals, astronomical observations, mythological commemorations, and royal anniversaries, reflects the comprehensive role that the temple played in the life of the community. The temple was not merely a religious institution. It was the community's calendar, the institution that organized time, that determined the rhythm of the year, that told the people when to plant, when to harvest, when to celebrate, and when to mourn. The 26 Ptolemies who ruled Egypt during the period of Edfu's construction presented a complex succession picture. The dynasty was plagued by internal conflict, civil wars between rival claimants, assassinations of siblings and parents, marriages between brothers and sisters that were designed to concentrate power, but that also concentrated dysfunction. The political turbulence of the Ptolemaic court, which included some of the most violent and Byzantine power struggles in the history of the ancient world, stands in stark contrast to the serenity and permanence of the temples that the dynasty produced. The temples are calm, the politics were catastrophic, and the contrast between the two, between the eternal order depicted on the temple walls and the murderous chaos of the Ptolemaic court, is one of the great ironies of Hellenistic history. At Edfu, the contrast is especially vivid. The reliefs show the pharaoh, whichever Ptolemy happened to be on the throne at the time of the carving, performing the rituals of divine kingship with calm, confident authority. The pharaoh smites enemies. The pharaoh offers to gods. The pharaoh maintains the cosmic order. The reliefs present a picture of serene, untroubled sovereignty, a king in complete control of his realm, blessed by the gods, beloved by his people. The reality was different. Several of the Ptolemies who are depicted at Edfu ruled in the midst of civil war. Ptolemy VIII, who oversaw significant construction at the temple, was one of the most violent and unpopular rulers of the dynasty. He murdered his nephew, married his brother's wife, expelled the Greek population of Alexandria, and provoked a civil war that split Egypt for years. Ptolemy XII, who added the final decorations to the temple, was expelled from Egypt by his own subjects and had to be reinstated by Roman troops. These were not serene, divinely blessed monarchs. They were desperate, embattled rulers, clinging to power through a combination of military force, bribery, and the carefully managed propaganda of the temple walls. The temples were the propaganda. They were the instrument through which the Ptolemies projected an image of stability, legitimacy, and divine favor that bore no relationship to the actual conditions of their rule. The reliefs at Edfu do not depict the Ptolemaic dynasty as it was. They depict it as it wanted to be seen, as a succession of pious, powerful, divinely sanctioned rulers, governing Egypt in harmony with the cosmic order, building temples, making offerings, fulfilling the obligations of Egyptian kingship with the same devotion that the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom had shown 3,000 years earlier. The gap between the image and the reality is itself instructive. It tells us that the temple was not a mirror, it was a lens. It did not reflect the world as it was. It refracted the world as the builders wanted it to be. And the refraction, the deliberate distortion, the calculated idealization, the systematic substitution of order for chaos is the most revealing feature of the temple's decorative program. It tells us not what the Ptolemies did, but what they wanted us to think they did. And that distinction between fact and aspiration, between reality and propaganda, is the key to understanding every ancient temple, every royal monument, every piece of official art that the ancient world has left behind. Walk through the Temple of Edfu as a visitor would, from the blazing sunlight of the entrance to the absolute darkness of the sanctuary. Begin at the Great Pylon. The gateway is 36 meters high, the height of a 12-story building, and 79 meters wide. It is the tallest surviving pylon in Egypt, and its scale is deliberately overwhelming. The facade is decorated with colossal reliefs showing the pharaoh, Ptolemy XII, the last king to work on the temple, smiting his enemies before the god Horus. The scene is conventional. Every Egyptian pylon from the New Kingdom onward carries the same image, but the execution is Ptolemaic in its detail and its precision. The enemies are depicted with ethnographic specificity, different hairstyles, different clothing, different weapons for each group. The pharaoh wears the double crown and holds the hair of his captives in one hand while raising a mace in the other. Horus, in his falcon-headed form, watches approvingly from above. The relief is propaganda, pure, undiluted, 3,000-year-old propaganda. A Greek king, depicted as an Egyptian pharaoh, performing an Egyptian ritual on the wall of an Egyptian temple for the benefit of an Egyptian god. The political calculation is transparent, but the artistry is genuine. The relief is carved with a precision and a confidence that reflects the best traditions of Ptolemaic craftsmanship. The Ptolemies may have been foreign kings, but their temple builders were Egyptian masters. Pass through the pylon gateway and enter the court of offerings, an open courtyard surrounded on three sides by colonnades of 32 columns, each one topped with a composite floral capital of distinctive Ptolemaic design. The columns of the Ptolemaic period are among the most elaborate in Egyptian architecture. Their capitals combine lotus flowers, palm fronds, papyrus bundles, and other botanical motifs in compositions that are more varied and more complex than anything produced during the pharaonic period. No two capitals at Edfu are identical. Each one is a unique composition, carved by a craftsman who was working within a tradition, but who was also within the bounds of that tradition, expressing individual creativity. The courtyard was the most public space in the temple, the only area accessible to the general population during festivals. Here, the great processions would gather. Here, the sacred bark of Horus would be displayed to the assembled worshippers. Here, the ritual slaughter of sacrificial animals would take place. And here, during the annual festival of the Beautiful Meeting, when the goddess Hathor travelled from her temple at Dendera, 165 kilometers to the north, to visit her husband Horus at Edfu, the sacred marriage of the two deities would be celebrated with music, dancing, feasting, and public joy. The Festival of the Beautiful Meeting was the most important event in the Edfu religious calendar. It lasted for 14 days. The golden statue of Hathor was transported by boat from Dendera to Edfu, a journey that took several days, and that was accompanied by a flotilla of priestly vessels and attended by crowds of worshippers along the riverbanks. At Edfu, the statues of Horus and Hathor were reunited in the sanctuary, the divine couple, together again, renewing their sacred marriage, regenerating the cosmic order through their union. The reliefs that depict the Festival of the Beautiful Meeting are among the most detailed narrative programs at Edfu. They show every stage of the festival: the departure of Hathor from Dendera, the river journey, the arrival at Edfu, the reception by the priests of Horus, the ritual activities within the temple, and the return of Hathor to her home. The reliefs are not merely decorative, they are liturgical. They served as the script for the festival, providing the priests with a visual guide to the sequence of rituals, the placement of offerings, the text of the hymns, and the choreography of the processions. Continue through the courtyard and enter the first hypostyle hall, the pronaos. The transition is dramatic. The courtyard is open to the sky, flooded with sunlight. The pronaos is roofed, enclosed, dramatically darker. 18 columns, arranged in 3 rows of 6, support a ceiling that retains traces of its original astronomical decoration: stars, vultures, and winged sun discs painted in vivid colours on the smooth sandstone surface. The ceiling paint is among the best preserved in Egypt, protected by the depth of the hall, by the overhang of the roof, and by the centuries of sand that sealed the room before the paint could fade. The walls of the pronaos are covered with ritual texts and offering scenes. The prescribed rituals for each festival day, the hymns to be chanted, the offerings to be presented. The texts are arranged in registers, horizontal bands of hieroglyphs, separated by carved lines that run the full length of each wall. The density of inscription is extraordinary. Thousands of hieroglyphs per wall, each one carved with the precision of a printed character, each one legible, each one contributing to the encyclopedic record of temple practice that makes Edfu unique. Between the first and second hypostyle halls stands one of the most unusual features of the temple, the laboratory. This small room, located to the left of the central axis, was where the sacred incense, oils, and unguents used in the daily rituals were prepared. The walls of the laboratory are inscribed with recipes, chemical formulae for the preparation of sacred substances, listing the ingredients, the quantities, the mixing procedures, and the appropriate occasions for use. These recipes are among the oldest chemical prescriptions in the world, practical instructions for making specific substances carved in stone in a temple more than 2,000 years ago. The laboratory recipes include formulations for kifi, the most famous of Egyptian incenses, a complex mixture of ingredients including juniper berries, frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, and honey, ground and mixed according to a precise procedure that took several days to complete. The Kai-Fi recipe at Edfu is the most detailed version of this famous formula that survives from antiquity, more complete than the versions preserved in Greek and Roman sources, and more specific about quantities and procedures. Modern perfumers and chemists have used the Edfu recipe to reconstruct kefi with varying degrees of success. The scent, by all accounts, is extraordinary: warm, complex, sweet, and intensely fragrant. Beyond the pronaos lies the second hypostyle hall, the Hall of Appearances, smaller, darker, and more restricted in access. 12 columns support a lower ceiling. The light dims further. The temperature drops. The sense of increasing sanctity, of approaching the divine, is palpable. The walls depict the foundation rituals of the temple: the king stretching the cord, digging the trench, moulding the first brick, consecrating the building. These scenes record, in visual form, the very moment of the temple's creation, the first act of construction, the first imposition of sacred order on profane ground. Beyond the Hall of Appearances, the spaces narrow further. A series of small chambers, storerooms, vestries, and ritual preparation rooms flanks the central axis. And at the end of the axis, in the deepest and darkest recess of the temple, stands the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, the room where Horus dwelt. The sanctuary at Edfu is one of the most atmospheric spaces in Egyptian archaeology. It is small, only a few meters across. It is dark. No natural light enters. It is dominated by the naos, the great granite shrine of Nectanebo II, standing in the center of the room, its polished surfaces reflecting the light of the visitor's torch. The naos is empty now. The golden statue of Horus that it once contained was removed or destroyed in antiquity. But the shrine itself endures. The oldest object in the temple, the one element that the Ptolemaic builders refused to replace, the dwelling of the god, carved from a single block of granite 4 centuries before the temple that houses it was begun. Stand in the sanctuary, let the darkness settle, let the flashlight play across the inscriptions on the walls, the ritual texts that describe what happened in this room, in this darkness, every morning for 300 years. The purification, the unsealing, the unveiling, the washing, the anointing, the dressing, the offering, the resealing, the withdrawal. Every step is described, every action is prescribed, every word is recorded, and every word was spoken in this room, in this darkness, by a succession of priests, whose names are mostly forgotten, but whose ritual lives are preserved, in exhaustive detail, on the walls they served. This is what preservation means. Not merely the survival of the building, the survival of the instructions, the survival of the knowledge, the survival of the daily, mundane, sacred routine that transformed a stone room into the dwelling of a god. The temple is the container, the ritual is the content, and at Edfu uniquely both have survived. The architectural vocabulary of the Temple of Edfu reflects a fascinating cultural synthesis. The temple follows the traditional Egyptian plan: pylon, courtyard, hypostyle, hall, sanctuary, with scrupulous fidelity. The proportions are Egyptian, the decorative program is Egyptian, the theological content is Egyptian, but the execution includes elements that betray the Ptolemaic, Greek-influenced environment in which the temple was built. The column capitals of Edfu are the most visible example. Traditional pharaonic temples used a limited repertoire of column capitals: papyrus bundles, lotus flowers, palm leaves, and the Hathor-headed capital. The Ptolemaic builders at Edfu expanded this repertoire dramatically, creating composite capitals that combined multiple botanical motifs in a single design. Each capital is unique, a different combination of flowers, leaves, and buds, carved with a precision and a variety that reflect the Ptolemaic taste for elaborate, differentiated design. The effect is one of controlled diversity. Each column is individual, but all are part of the same family, variations on a theme, rather than repetitions of a pattern. This approach to column design has no exact precedent in pharaonic architecture. It reflects a sensibility that is more Greek than Egyptian. The Greek value of individual expression within a common framework, as opposed to the Egyptian value of repetition and uniformity. The Ptolemaic builders were not simply copying pharaonic models, they were interpreting them, bringing their own aesthetic sensibility to a traditional form, creating something that was recognizably Egyptian in its overall conception, but distinctively Ptolemaic in its details. The relief carving at Edfu also shows this synthesis. The compositions are Egyptian, the standard offering scenes, the standard festival depictions, the standard mythological narratives, but the carving technique is more detailed, more deeply cut, and more precisely finished than most pharaonic work. The hieroglyphs are carved with a crispness that approaches the quality of printed type. Each sign clearly defined, each stroke precise, each line sharp. The effect is one of extraordinary legibility. The inscriptions at Edfu are among the easiest to read of any Egyptian temple, not because the language is simple, but because the carving is so precise. The outer enclosure wall of the temple carries a decorative program that is unique to Edfu. The exterior face of the wall is carved with a continuous narrative depicting the myth of Horus and Seth. The cosmic battle between order and chaos, told in a sequence of scenes that runs the full length of the wall. The narrative is accompanied by explanatory texts, captions, dialogue, and stage directions that transform the carved images into a readable story. The enclosure wall is, in effect, a comic strip, a sequential narrative told in images and text, designed to be read in sequence, from beginning to end. The enclosure wall also carries a text known as the building text, the most detailed construction record from any ancient Egyptian temple. The text describes the foundation ceremony, the dimensions of each element of the building, the dates of each phase of construction, and the names of the kings under whom each phase was completed. The text is both a historical record and a theological document. It describes the construction of the temple as an act of cosmic creation, analogous to the creation of the universe by the gods. The building of the temple was not merely an engineering project. It was a reenactment of the first creation, a human echo of the divine act that brought the world into being. The Mamisi, the birthhouse, located in front of the temple's entrance, is another distinctive feature of the Edfu complex. The Mamisi was a small temple dedicated to the divine birth of Hatshepsut, the son of Horus and Hathor, whose birth was celebrated annually in a festival that included processions, music, dancing, and dramatic performances. The Mamisi at Edfu, built during the reigns of Ptolemy VIII and Ptolemy IX, is decorated with scenes of the divine birth, the conception, the pregnancy, the delivery, the presentation of the infant God to his parents. The scenes are accompanied by texts that provide the liturgical script for the birth festival. The hymns, the prayers, the ritual actions that transformed the annual celebration into a cosmic event. The Mamisi was not unique to Edfu. Birthhouses were attached to several Ptolemaic temples, including Dendera and Philae, but the Edfu Mamisi is among the best preserved, and its inscriptions provide the most detailed record of the birth festival's ritual program. The texts describe a celebration that combined elements of theatre, music, and liturgy, a multi-day event that involved the entire community of Edfu and that attracted pilgrims from across Upper Egypt. The best columns in the Mamisi are among the most distinctive architectural features at Edfu. The dwarf god Bez, protector of childbirth, defender against evil spirits, guardian of the household, was depicted on the columns with his characteristic grimacing face, his bowed legs, and his feathered crown. The columns combine structural function with apotropic function. They support the roof while simultaneously warding off malign influences from the sacred space of the birthhouse. The best figures are carved in high relief, projecting from the column surface with a three-dimensionality that is unusual in Egyptian architecture. They are, in effect, sculptures attached to columns, hybrid objects that blur the boundary between architecture and art. The sacred well of the temple, located in the courtyard, served a dual function. It provided the water for the priest's ritual purification, the daily bathing that was required before any priest could enter the sacred precincts, and it symbolized the primordial waters of Nun, the infinite ocean that existed before creation, from which the first land emerged. The well was not merely a water source. It was a cosmological symbol, a physical representation of the waters of chaos contained within the walls of the Temple of Order. By bathing in the well, the priest symbolically entered the chaos and emerged purified, reenacting the creation of order from chaos, performing in microcosm the cosmic act that the temple as a whole was designed to maintain. The roof of the temple, accessible by a staircase from the interior, was used for specific astronomical rituals, most notably the union with the sun disk, a New Year ceremony in which the sacred statue of Horus was carried to the roof at dawn and exposed to the first rays of the rising sun. The ceremony was designed to recharge the statue's divine energy, to renew the god's connection to the sun, which was the ultimate source of divine power in Egyptian theology. The roof, at the highest point of the building, was the closest point to the sun, the place where the human and the cosmic came closest to touching. The staircase that led to the roof was inscribed with ritual texts describing the ascent. Texts that transformed a physical climb into a theological journey, a movement from the earthly to the celestial, from the human to the divine. The annual New Year festival at Edfu was, after the Festival of the Beautiful Meeting and the Festival of Victory, the third major celebration in the temple's calendar. The festival lasted several days and included the renewal of all the temple's sacred objects, the washing, anointing, and redressing of the cult statues, the reconsecration of the ritual vessels, and the purification of every room and surface in the building. The festival was a comprehensive reset, a return to the pristine condition of the first day, a recreation of the temple's original state, a renewal of the cosmic order that the temple was designed to maintain. The inscriptions that describe the New Year festival are carved on the walls of the staircase and the roof chapel. They provide a complete liturgical script for the ceremony. The hymns to be chanted during the ascent, the ritual actions to be performed on the roof, the prayers to be offered at the moment of sunrise. The texts are so detailed that a modern scholar, armed with the inscriptions and a knowledge of hieroglyphs, could reconstruct the ceremony in its entirety, could, in theory, climb the staircase, emerge onto the roof, face the eastern horizon, and perform the ritual of the union with the sun disk, exactly as the priests of Edfu performed it 2,000 years ago. The ritual would work, the sunrise would come, the prayers would be spoken, the incense would burn, everything would be in place, except the faith, the belief that the ceremony actually renewed the god's connection to the sun, the conviction that the ritual was not merely symbolic but functional, that without it, the cosmic order would falter, the sun would weaken, the world would tilt toward chaos. That faith is gone. The ritual is preserved, and the gap between the two, between the faith that made the ritual meaningful and the text that preserves its form, is the gap that separates the living Temple of Edfu from the dead one. The question of what it means for a temple to be the best preserved deserves more careful examination. Preservation is not a binary condition. It is a spectrum, a continuum from complete destruction to perfect survival, with every monument occupying a specific position on that continuum. To say that Edfu is the best preserved temple in Egypt is to say that it occupies a position on the spectrum that is closer to perfect survival than any other temple. But it is not perfectly preserved. It has been damaged, it has been defaced, it has been modified, and the differences between its current condition and its original condition, the gaps between what it is and what it was, are themselves informative. The most visible damage is the Christian defacement. The faces of the gods on the exterior walls have been systematically chipped away, the eyes, the noses, the mouths removed with chisels, leaving blank ovals where the features once were. The damage is confined almost entirely to the exterior surfaces. The interior, which was buried by sand before the Christians could reach it, is largely untouched. But the exterior damage is extensive and in some cases severe. Entire figures have been reduced to faceless silhouettes, recognizable by their posture, their clothing, and their accompanying inscriptions, but deprived of the individual features that would have given them identity and expression. The Christian defacement at Edfu is not unique. Similar damage is visible at virtually every ancient Egyptian temple that was accessible during the early Christian period. The defacement was motivated by the theological belief that pagan images possessed dangerous spiritual power, that the carved faces of the gods were not merely representations but actual embodiments of divine presence, and that leaving them intact would perpetuate the pagan religion that Christianity was trying to replace. By removing the faces, the Christians believed they were neutralizing the spiritual power of the images, rendering them harmless, diffusing their pagan charge, converting them from dangerous idols into inert stone. The logic of the defacement, the belief that images possess spiritual power and that the destruction of the face destroys the power, is itself an inheritance from Egyptian theology. The Egyptians believed that images were alive, that a carved figure of a god, properly consecrated, contained the actual presence of the deity. The opening of the mouth ceremony, performed on statues and temple reliefs as part of the consecration process, was designed to activate the image, to transform it from inert stone into a living vessel of divine presence. The Christians, who shared this belief in the power of images, responded to it by destroying the feature that was considered most essential to the image's vitality, the face. Without a face, the image could not see. Without eyes, it could not observe. Without a mouth, it could not speak. The defacement was not vandalism. It was theology, the application of the same principles of image power that had governed Egyptian religion for 3,000 years, now deployed in reverse, to neutralize rather than activate. The soot that blackened the ceilings of the interior chambers tells a different story. The The soot was deposited by oil lamps, the same lamps that the priests of Horus had used to illuminate the temple's dark interior for 3 centuries. The lamps burned animal fat or vegetable oil, producing a thick, oily smoke that rose to the ceiling and deposited a layer of carbon on the painted surface. Over 300 years of daily use, the soot layer grew thick. In some areas, several millimeters of carbon accumulated on the ceiling, obscuring the painted decoration beneath. When Mariette excavated the temple and the first modern visitors entered the interior, the soot was still in place, a dark, greasy film that covered every ceiling surface and that obscured the astronomical decorations and divine images that had been painted there 2,000 years earlier. The cleaning of the soot, undertaken in stages over the following decades, revealed the original painted decoration in vivid detail. Colours that had been protected by the soot from the light and air that would have faded them, surfaces that had been shielded by a layer of ancient carbon from the temperature fluctuations that would have caused them to crack. The soot, paradoxically, preserved what it covered. The carbon layer acted as a barrier, a sealant that protected the underlying paint from the environmental conditions that destroy exposed pigments. The cleaning removed the barrier. The paint, newly exposed, is now vulnerable to the same conditions that destroyed the paint in every other temple in Egypt. The cleaning was necessary. The decoration was invisible beneath the soot, but it was also, in a conservation sense, destructive. It removed the protective layer that had preserved the paint for 2 millennia. This paradox, that protection and concealment are the same thing, that revealing the art exposes it to the forces that destroy it, that the most preserved surfaces are the ones that have been most thoroughly hidden, is the central paradox of heritage conservation. It applies at Edfu. It applies at Lascaux, where the discovery of the painted caves led to the deterioration of the paintings and the eventual closure of the caves to the public. It applies at Pompeii, where the excavation of the buried city exposed its frescoes to the Italian weather and the Italian tourism industry. And it applies at every archaeological site in the world where the act of discovery is also, inevitably, the beginning of destruction. The Temple of Edfu was preserved by burial. It was revealed by excavation, and it is now being destroyed, slowly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly, by the very conditions of its revelation. The sand was its protector, the air is its enemy, and the gap between the two, between the sealed, dark, stable environment that preserved the temple for 15 centuries and the open, lit, variable environment that has been exposing it for the last century and a half, is the gap that conservation bridge. The bridge is imperfect. Conservation can slow the deterioration, but cannot stop it. The sandstone will continue to erode, the paint will continue to fade, the salts will continue to crystallize, and the temple, however carefully maintained, will continue to lose material, lose detail, lose the sharp-edged precision that Chassinard documented in his 14 volumes more than a century ago. But the loss is slow. The deterioration is measured in decades and centuries, not in years and months. The Temple of Edfu has survived for 2,260 years. It has survived intact for a century and a half since excavation. And with proper conservation, with the investment of resources, the application of science, and the commitment of the Egyptian and international archaeological communities, it can survive for centuries more, not forever. Nothing survives forever, but long enough for the inscriptions to be fully translated, long enough for the myths to be fully understood, long enough for the rituals to be fully reconstructed, long enough for the knowledge that the temple contains to be extracted, published, and preserved in forms that will outlast the stone. And that is, perhaps, the ultimate purpose of the Temple of Edfu in the modern world. Not to house a god, the god is gone. Not to serve as a place of worship, the worship has ceased. But to serve as a source of knowledge, a library in stone, 3,000 square meters of inscribed surface, containing the most comprehensive record of ancient Egyptian religion that exists anywhere on earth. The temple's purpose has changed, its value has not. And the value of the knowledge, the value of the information, the value of 3,000 square meters of ancient text carved on the walls of the best preserved temple in Egypt is beyond calculation. The deeper truth of the Temple of Edfu is the truth about the relationship between preservation and knowledge. between the survival of a building and the survival of the information it contains. Most ancient Egyptian temples have been destroyed, and with them, the information they carried. The reliefs that covered their walls, the ritual prescriptions, the mythological narratives, the administrative records have been reduced to fragments. The painted surfaces that decorated their ceilings, the astronomical charts, the divine images, the cosmic symbols have been lost entirely. The daily rituals that were performed within their sanctuaries, the sequences of actions, the texts of the hymns, the recipes for the incense, are known to us only through scattered references in papyri and secondary sources. The destruction of the temples has created enormous gaps in our understanding of Egyptian religion. Gaps that can never be fully closed because the information that would close them was carved on walls that no longer exist. Edfu is the exception, and the exception is so comprehensive that it has reshaped our understanding of the rule. Before Edfu was fully published, before Shassinad's 14 volumes made the temple's inscriptions available to the scholarly world, Egyptologists had to reconstruct Egyptian temple ritual from fragmentary and often contradictory sources. After Edfu, they had a complete manual, a temple that described its own operations, a building that contained, on its walls, the instructions for its own use. Let that sink in. The Temple of Edfu is the only ancient Egyptian building that comes with an instruction manual. The walls describe the rituals. The rooms house the descriptions. The descriptions and the rooms are the same building. This is architectural self-documentation of a kind that has no parallel in the ancient world. No Greek temple describes its own rituals on its walls. No Roman temple provides recipes for its own incense. No Mesopotamian ziggurat contains a room-by-room guide to its own operation. Only Edfu does this. And only Edfu could do this, because only Edfu has survived intact enough to preserve the relationship between text and space, between description and setting, between manual and machine. The information preserved at Edfu extends far beyond the daily ritual. The walls contain mythological texts, including the most complete surviving version of the myth of Horus and Seth, the cosmic battle between order and chaos that was the foundational narrative of Egyptian kingship. The myth carved on the walls of the temple's inner corridor tells the story of Horus's battle against his uncle Seth, the god of disorder, of the desert, of storms and violence, to avenge the murder of his father Osiris and to claim the throne of Egypt. The battle is depicted in a sequence of scenes that constitute the oldest known example of dramatic narrative in the history of literature. A story told in images and text, arranged sequentially on the walls, designed to be read as a continuous narrative from beginning to end. During the annual Festival of Victory, one of the most important festivals in the Edfu calendar, the myth of Horus and Seth was performed as a ritual drama. Priests wearing masks and costumes enacted the roles of the gods. The battle was fought with ritual weapons. Seth, depicted as a hippopotamus, was symbolically slain by Horus. The victory of order over chaos was celebrated with music, dancing, and the consumption of a ritually prepared hippopotamus-shaped cake. The Festival of Victory was, in effect, the oldest known theatrical performance in history, a scripted, staged, costume drama performed in a purpose-built setting for an audience of worshippers who participated in the cosmic victory through their attendance. The texts that describe the Festival of Victory are carved on the walls of the inner corridor, the narrow passage that runs between the sanctuary and the outer wall of the temple. This corridor, accessible only to priests, was the backstage of the temple's theatrical program, the place where the ritual drama was prepared, rehearsed, and performed. The text provides stage directions, dialogue, descriptions of costumes and props, and instructions for the timing and choreography of each scene. They are, in modern terms, a script, the libretto of a sacred opera, carved in stone on the walls of the theatre where it was performed. This is not science fiction. This is documented, inscribed, archaeologically verified fact. The Temple of Edfu contains the script for the world's oldest theatrical performance. The script is still legible, the theatre is still standing, and the performance, though it has not been staged for 17 centuries, could, in theory, be reconstructed from the texts with a high degree of fidelity. The words are there, the stage directions are there, the blocking is there, The costume descriptions are there. Everything that a modern director would need to restage the Festival of Victory. Everything except the actors and the audience is preserved on the walls of the inner corridor at Edfu, and this is what preservation means at its deepest level. Not merely the survival of stone, the survival of knowledge, the survival of a complete cultural system, ritual, mythology, drama, theology, chemistry, astronomy, architecture, encoded in the walls of a building that was sealed by sand and opened by archaeology. The Temple of Edfu is not just a preserved building, it is a preserved civilization, a snapshot of late Egyptian culture, frozen in sandstone, readable to anyone with the patience and the knowledge to decode it. The Mariette excavation of Edfu in the 1860s was one of the landmark events of 19th century Egyptology. Auguste Mariette, who had already discovered the Serapeum at Saqqara and who had been appointed the first director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, arrived at Edfu with a clear objective: to clear the sand and debris that had buried the temple and to reveal the monument to public view. The excavation was not a research project in the modern sense. Mariette's primary goal was exposure, not analysis. He wanted to see the temple, to make it visible, to add it to the inventory of Egyptian monuments that were being documented and preserved under his directorship. The conditions of the excavation were difficult. The sand was deep. In places, more than 12 meters of accumulated material covered the ancient floor. The houses of the modern town had been built on top of the buried temple, and some of them had to be demolished to allow the excavation to proceed. The residents were not always cooperative. The disruption to their homes and their livelihoods was considerable, and the compensation offered was often inadequate by the standards of the day. Mariette persevered, but the social cost of the excavation was significant, and the relationship between the archaeological mission and the local community was strained. The excavation revealed the temple in stages: first the top of the pylon, then the upper portions of the courtyard walls, then the columns of the hypostyle halls, and finally the sanctuary and the innermost chambers. Each stage brought new revelations, new inscriptions, new reliefs, new architectural features that had been invisible for more than a millennium. The most dramatic moment came when the sanctuary was cleared and the naos of Nectanebo II was revealed, still standing, still intact, still in its original position, with the polished granite surfaces reflecting the light of the excavator's lanterns. The naos had been sealed in darkness for more than 1,500 years. Its emergence into the light was, for Mariette and his team, a moment of genuine archaeological emotion. The subsequent documentation of the temple was a multi-generational effort. Mariette himself produced preliminary descriptions and plans. The comprehensive epigraphic record was begun by Émile Chassagne in 1892 and continued until his death in 1947. Chassagne's 14-volume publication, Le Temple d'Edfu, is one of the monumental works of Egyptological scholarship, representing decades of sustained labour by a single individual. The work involved the transcription of every hieroglyphic inscription on every surface of the temple, a task of extraordinary patience and precision, conducted in conditions that were often uncomfortable. The temple interior in the pre-electric era could only be examined by lantern light. The inscriptions in some areas were partially obscured by soot from the lanterns of previous visitors, and the hieroglyphic text of the Ptolemaic period, written in a deliberately arcane and complex style, was among the most difficult to translate in the entire corpus of Egyptian texts. The Ptolemaic hieroglyphs at Edfu are a distinctive feature of the temple's inscriptions. The Ptolemaic period saw a dramatic expansion of the hieroglyphic sign list, from roughly 700 signs in the pharaonic period to more than 7,000 in the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. The expansion was driven by the priests' desire to create a more complex, more nuanced, and more esoteric system of writing, a sacred script that could express theological concepts with greater precision, and that was at the same time more difficult for the uninitiated to read. The hieroglyphs at Edfu are, in effect, a code, a deliberately obscure system of writing, designed to restrict access to the sacred texts, to create an intellectual boundary between the priesthood and the general population. This codification of knowledge, the deliberate restriction of access to sacred information through the use of a complex writing system, is one of the most striking features of the Ptolemaic temple program. The priests of Edfu were not merely preserving knowledge, they were hoarding it. They were creating an intellectual monopoly, a system in which access to the sacred texts required years of training in a writing system that was, by design, more difficult than it needed to be. The complexity of the Ptolemaic hieroglyphs was not an accident. It was a strategy for maintaining priestly authority in a world where the political power of the priesthood was being challenged by Greek administrators, Roman governors, and the progressive secularization of Egyptian society. The strategy worked for a time. The complexity of the hieroglyphic script ensured that only the priests could read the temple walls. The temple remained an intellectual sanctuary, a place where sacred knowledge was preserved, transmitted, and protected from outside interference. But the strategy also had a fatal consequence. When the temples were closed and the priesthood was dissolved, the ability to read the hieroglyphs was lost. The last known hieroglyphic inscription in Egypt dates to 394 of the Common Era, a graffito at the Temple of Philae. After that date, no one on earth could read the ancient Egyptian script. The code was secure, but the code breakers were gone. And the inscriptions at Edfu, all 3,000 square meters of them, the most extensive hieroglyphic corpus in Egypt, became unreadable. They would remain unreadable for 14 centuries, until Jean-François Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone in 1822 and opened the door to the recovery of the ancient Egyptian written language. The irony is precise. The priests of Edfu made their writing as complex as possible to prevent outsiders from reading their sacred texts. The complexity succeeded so well that even the priests themselves eventually forgot how to read it. The code defeated its own creators, and the inscriptions, designed to be read by a privileged few, ended up being read by no one at all, until modern Egyptology, building on Champollion's foundation, slowly and painstakingly reconstructed the ability to decode the Ptolemaic hieroglyphic system, and began the process of reading the walls of Edfu for the first time in nearly 2 millennia. That process is still ongoing. The inscriptions at Edfu are so extensive, so complex, and so detailed that their complete translation and interpretation remains a work in progress. Dieter Kurth's ongoing translation project, which has been producing scholarly volumes since the 1980s, has translated a significant portion of the temple's texts. But the work is not complete. New readings are proposed. Old translations are revised. Disputes about the meaning of specific passages continue among specialists. The Temple of Edfu is still being read, 2,200 years after its inscriptions were carved, 2 centuries after the hieroglyphic code was cracked, and more than a century after Shassina first copied the texts by lantern light. The reading will never be finished. The texts are too extensive, too complex, too rich in allusion and reference and theological nuance to be fully exhausted by any single generation of scholars. Each new reading reveals new information, each new translation opens new questions, and the temple, with its 3,000 square meters of inscribed surface, provides more than enough material to sustain centuries of future scholarship. This inexhaustibility, this quality of producing new knowledge with each new reading, is the truest measure of the temple's preservation. A preserved building is valuable. A preserved building that continues to generate new knowledge is priceless. And Edfu, with its inscriptions, its reliefs, its architectural record, and its ritual texts, is generating new knowledge every year, new insights into Egyptian religion, new understanding of Ptolemaic politics, new information about the daily operations of an ancient temple. The knowledge was buried in sand for 15 centuries. It has been emerging steadily for the last century and a half, and the emergence shows no sign of slowing. The Temple of Edfu is not a monument to the past. It is a machine for producing knowledge, a knowledge machine built of sandstone and hieroglyphs, powered by the patient labour of scholars who read its walls and publish their findings. The machine was turned off for 1,500 years. Mariette turned it back on, and it has been running ever since, producing, year after year, the information that transforms our understanding of one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history. The concept of the temple as a library in stone, A phrase used by several scholars to describe Edfu carries implications that extend beyond the metaphorical. The temple was, in the most literal sense, a library. It contained books, papyrus scrolls stored in the catalogue room, covering subjects from ritual practice to astronomy. It contained texts, 3,000 square meters of hieroglyphic inscription, representing the largest continuous body of Ptolemaic Egyptian text in existence. It contained knowledge, the accumulated theological, scientific, and administrative wisdom of centuries of priestly scholarship, encoded in a writing system designed to be permanent and, at the same time, exclusive. The destruction of the papyrus library, the loss of the scrolls, whose titles are inscribed on the catalogue room wall, is one of the great intellectual losses of the ancient world. The titles alone suggest a breadth of learning that we can barely reconstruct from the surviving evidence. Knowledge of the periodic returns of the two stars implies astronomical observation of planetary cycles. The Book of the Protection of the God's Image implies a systematic theology of sacred images. The inventory of what is in the temple implies a comprehensive administrative record that would have provided information about every aspect of the temple's operations. These books are gone. The papyrus on which they were written has not survived. The knowledge they contained has been lost, not because it was unimportant, but because the medium on which it was recorded was perishable. The stone inscriptions survive, the papyrus texts do not, and the disparity between the two, between the permanence of the inscriptions and the fragility of the scrolls, is the same disparity that characterizes every ancient library that has been lost to time. The Library of Alexandria, the libraries of the monasteries destroyed during the Viking raids, the indigenous libraries of the Americas, burned by Spanish conquistadors. Each of these losses represents a catastrophic reduction in human knowledge, a permanent diminution of the collective intellectual heritage of the species. The Library of Edfu was smaller than the Library of Alexandria. Its loss was less famous, but it was no less consequential. The books that were stored in the catalogue room of the Temple of Horus represented the accumulated knowledge of one of the most sophisticated intellectual traditions in the ancient world, a tradition that had been developing, refining, and transmitting its knowledge for more than 3,000 years. The loss of those books is a loss that cannot be measured, because we do not know what they contained, we cannot know what we have lost. But the walls remain. And the walls contain information that the books may have expanded, explained, and contextualized, but that is, in its own right, enormously valuable. The ritual texts on the sanctuary walls provide the most complete surviving description of an Egyptian temple's daily operations. The festival calendar provides the most complete surviving record of an Egyptian temple's annual schedule. The myth of Horus and Seth provides the most complete surviving narrative of one of the foundational myths of Egyptian civilization. The incense recipes provide the most detailed surviving formulae for the preparation of sacred substances, and the building texts provide the most complete surviving record of the construction of an Egyptian temple. Each of these bodies of text would be significant if found in isolation. Together, in the same building in their original context, with their spatial relationships intact and their architectural setting preserved, they constitute a source of unparalleled richness and complexity. The Temple of Edfu is not merely the best preserved temple in Egypt, it is the best documented temple in Egypt, the temple that provides the most information about the most aspects of temple life, from the mundane to the cosmic, from the daily offering to the annual festival, from the recipe for incense to the script for the world's oldest theatrical performance. The modern scholarly engagement with Edfu began with Chassinar and continues with the work of Dieter Kurth, Sylvie Coville, and other specialists who have dedicated their careers to the translation and interpretation of the temple's inscriptions. Their work, published in scholarly journals, monographs, and multi-volume editions, constitutes a secondary library, a modern commentary on the ancient library in stone. The secondary library grows each year as new translations are published, new interpretations are proposed, and new connections are discovered between the texts at Edfu and the broader corpus of Egyptian religious literature. The relationship between the ancient library in stone and the modern library of commentary is itself a form of preservation. The stone library is deteriorating. The sand that once protected it is gone. The environment that now surrounds it is destructive. But the modern library, published in books, stored in archives, available in digital form, captures and preserves the information that the stone library contains. Each new publication is a transfer, a migration of information from one medium to another, from ancient stone to modern paper, from hieroglyphic inscription to scholarly analysis. The transfer is imperfect. Translation is always interpretation, and interpretation is always selective, but it is better than nothing. And nothing is what we would have if the modern scholars had not begun the work of reading, translating, and publishing the walls of the best preserved temple in Egypt. The work continues. The walls still hold their secrets, the hieroglyphs still await their readers, and the temple, silent, dark, magnificent, the most complete ancient temple on earth, still stands, still preserved, still readable, still yielding year after year the knowledge that it has been holding for 2,260 years, waiting, enduring. The best preserved temple in Egypt, the most important library in stone, the dwelling of a god who is gone, the manual for a ritual that has ceased, the script for a drama that will never be performed again, and the most eloquent, most complete, most perfectly preserved silence in the ancient world, stand in the sanctuary of Edfu, in the darkness beside the granite naos. The flashlight picks out the inscriptions on the walls, the ritual texts, the offering formulae, the hymns to Horus. The air is cool, still, undisturbed. The noise of the modern world, the tourist chatter, the donkey carts, the traffic of the nearby town, is inaudible. The sanctuary is sealed from the outside world by 60 meters of solid stone. The darkness is absolute. The silence is complete. This is what the priest experienced every morning for 300 years. This darkness, this silence, this moment of solitude before the god, the unsealing of the shrine, the revelation of the golden face, the whispered hymn, the smoke of incense rising in the torchlight, the ritual gestures, the washing, the anointing, the dressing, performed in total darkness except for the single flame that the priest carried, the intimacy of the encounter, a human being, alone, in a stone room, in the dark, serving a god. The modern visitor cannot replicate this experience. The tourist groups are too large, the flashlights too bright, the visit too brief, the context too different. But the setting is the same, the room is the same, the darkness is the same. And the naos, the granite shrine, polished, inscribed, 2,300 years old, is still there, still standing, still empty, still waiting for a god who will never return. The emptiness of the naos is the most eloquent object at Edfu. The shrine was designed to hold the golden statue of Horus, the small, exquisite figure that was the physical dwelling of the god on earth. The statue is gone. It was removed or destroyed in antiquity, possibly by the Christians who closed the temple, possibly by looters who wanted the gold. The shrine remains, and the shrine without its statue is a portrait of absence. A container without its contents, a home without its occupant, a temple without its god. This absence, the absence of the god from his own shrine, is the condition of every ancient Egyptian temple that has survived to the modern era. The buildings stand, the gods are gone, the rituals have ceased, the priests have departed. What remains is architecture, beautiful, informative, historically priceless architecture, and the knowledge that everything the architecture was designed to serve has been extinguished. The Temple of Edfu preserves this knowledge more completely than any other site. It preserves the architecture, it preserves the inscriptions, it preserves the ritual texts, it preserves the mythological narratives, it preserves the recipes for incense, it preserves the scripts for dramatic performances. It preserves, in exhaustive detail, the operational manual for a religious institution that was active for 3 centuries and that has been defunct for 17. The preservation is extraordinary. The loss is equally extraordinary. Because the one thing that Edfu cannot preserve, the one thing that no building, however intact, can preserve, is the faith, the belief, the conviction that the golden statue in the granite shrine was actually the god Horus, actually alive, actually present, actually in need of the daily washing and anointing and dressing that the priests provided. The faith is gone, the manual remains, and the gap between the two, between the faith that animated the ritual and the text that records it is the gap that separates a living religion from a dead one. A living religion is performed, a dead religion is studied, and the Temple of Edfu, for all its extraordinary preservation, has crossed from one category to the other. It is no longer a place of worship, it is a place of study, a museum, an archaeological site, a tourist attraction, the most perfectly preserved ancient temple in the world, and the most perfectly emptied. The conservation challenges facing the Temple of Edfu in the 21st century are different from those that faced it in antiquity, but no less serious. The temple survived burial. It survived the Christian conversion. It survived 15 centuries of abandonment. But it now faces a new set of threats. Threats that arise not from neglect but from attention, not from abandonment but from visitation, not from ignorance but from fame. The primary threat is tourism. Edfu is one of the most visited temples in Egypt, receiving hundreds of thousands of visitors per year. Most arrive as part of Nile cruise itineraries that stop at Edfu for a few hours between Luxor and Aswan. The visitors enter the temple in large groups, led by guides who amplify their voices to be heard above the crowd. The noise level is significant, the foot traffic is heavy. The physical impact of thousands of bodies moving through enclosed stone spaces. The moisture they exhale, the particulate matter they shed, the vibrations they generate, is measurable and cumulative. The moisture introduced by tourist breathing is a particular concern. The temple's interior spaces were sealed for 15 centuries, and during that period, the humidity inside the building was extremely low, consistent with the dry desert climate. The introduction of humid air, exhaled by visitors at a rate that can significantly increase the relative humidity in enclosed spaces, creates conditions that promote salt crystallization on the stone surfaces. The salts, dissolved in the moisture, migrate to the surface of the sandstone and crystallize as the moisture evaporates, generating mechanical stresses that cause the stone to flake and crumble. This process, known as salt weathering, is the same process that threatens every ancient monument in the Nile Valley. But at Edfu, the threat is exacerbated by the enclosed nature of the interior spaces and the high volume of tourist traffic. The painted surfaces are especially vulnerable. The pigments used in the temple's decoration, mineral-based pigments applied to a thin layer of gypsum plaster, are sensitive to moisture, light, and physical contact. The soot from ancient oil lamps, which accumulated on the ceilings during the temple's active period, provides some protection, a layer of carbon that shields the underlying paint from direct contact with the air. But the cleaning of this soot layer, which has been undertaken in some areas to reveal the original colors, removes the protective carbon and exposes the paint to the modern atmosphere. The dilemma is familiar in conservation. Cleaning reveals the art, but removes the protection. Leaving the soot preserves the surface, but hides the art. The Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities has implemented several measures to manage the impact of tourism on the temple. Visitor numbers are monitored. Pathways are defined to distribute foot traffic across the available floor space. Photography restrictions are enforced in the most sensitive interior areas, and conservation teams conduct regular monitoring of the stone surfaces, the painted decorations, and the structural stability of the building. But the scale of the challenge is immense. The Temple of Edfu is a working tourist attraction, a revenue-generating asset for the Egyptian economy, a major employer for the local community, and a cultural symbol of national pride. Restricting access would protect the monument, but would also reduce revenue, eliminate jobs, and deny the public access to one of the world's most important heritage sites. The tension between preservation and access is inherent and irresolvable. Every visitor contributes to the deterioration of the surfaces they have come to admire, and the cumulative effect of millions of visits over decades is measurable, progressive, and ultimately destructive. The tension is not unique to Edfu. It exists at every major heritage site in the world, from the Sistine Chapel to the caves of Lascaux, from Angkor Wat to Machu Picchu. The problem is structural. The sites that are most worth preserving are the sites that attract the most visitors, and the visitors who come to admire them are, collectively and individually, contributing to their destruction. There is no solution that eliminates the tension. There are only strategies that manage it. Limiting visitor numbers, controlling visitor behavior, monitoring environmental conditions, and investing in conservation research that develops new tools for protecting ancient surfaces from the impacts of modern use. The Temple of Edfu has survived for 2,260 years. It survived the Ptolemies, it survived the Romans, it survived the Christians, it survived 15 centuries of burial, it survived the excavation that exposed it to the modern atmosphere. The question now is whether it will survive the tourism that has made it famous, whether the very act of admiration, repeated by millions of visitors over the coming decades, will eventually destroy the surfaces that the sand spent 15 centuries protecting. The answer depends on conservation, on the investment of resources, financial, technical, and institutional, in the ongoing project of maintaining the temple's fabric in the face of forces that are relentless and cumulative. The sand protected Edfu for 15 centuries without any human effort. The modern world will have to protect it with enormous human effort, with monitoring, with research, with intervention, with the continuous, expensive, never-ending work of keeping a 2,000-year-old building from falling apart. The work is worth doing. The Temple of Edfu is irreplaceable. There is no backup copy. There is no digital replica that can substitute for the experience of standing in the sanctuary, beside the naos, in the darkness, reading the ritual texts on the walls by flashlight. The building and the information it contains are the same object. The manual and the machine, inseparable, interdependent, equally vulnerable. Losing the building means losing the information. And the information, the most complete record of ancient Egyptian temple practice that survives, is worth more than the cost of any conservation program that could be devised to protect it. The Temple of Edfu is the best preserved temple in Egypt. Keeping it that way is the challenge of the 21st century, a challenge that is technical, financial, institutional, and, ultimately, moral. The temple was built by people who believed it would last forever. The sand gave it 15 centuries of grace. The excavation gave it a second life. The question now is how long the second life will last, and whether the modern world has the commitment, the resources, and the will to give the temple a third. The geographical position of Edfu within the broader Nile Valley landscape adds another dimension to the temple's significance. Edfu sits roughly midway between Luxor and Aswan, between the great temple complexes of Thebes to the north and the frontier temples of Nubia to the south. This position made it a natural stopping point for travellers on the Nile and a strategic node in the religious geography of Upper Egypt. The falcon god Horus of Edfu was not merely a local deity. He was a member of the national pantheon, one of the most important gods in the Egyptian state religion, worshipped from the delta to the cataracts. The Ptolemaic builders understood this national significance and designed the temple accordingly. The scale of the building, 137 meters long, 36 meters high at the pylon, was appropriate not for a local shrine, but for a national monument. The comprehensiveness of the inscriptions, covering every aspect of theology, mythology, ritual, and administration, was appropriate not for a provincial temple, but for a definitive statement of Egyptian religious practice. And the quality of the construction, the precision of the carving, the refinement of the architectural detailing, the sophistication of the decorative program, was appropriate not for a regional cult center, but for one of the most important temples in Egypt. The temple's importance was recognized by the Ptolemaic state, which provided substantial financial support for its construction and maintenance. The agricultural estates assigned to the temple generated revenues that fund not only the daily operations and the annual festivals, but also the ongoing construction program that continued for 180 years. The state's investment in Edfu was an investment in legitimacy, the price of maintaining the Egyptian priesthood's support for a dynasty of Greek rulers who depended on that support for their political survival. The investment paid dividends. The priests of Horus at Edfu were among the most loyal supporters of the Ptolemaic dynasty. maintaining the royal cult, performing the prescribed rituals, and depicting the Ptolemaic kings on the temple walls with the same reverence that they would have accorded to a native Egyptian pharaoh. The temple was a contract, a mutually beneficial arrangement between the Greek court and the Egyptian priesthood, sealed in stone, funded by agricultural revenue, and maintained for nearly 3 centuries. The end of this arrangement, the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BC, following the death of Cleopatra VII, did not immediately affect the Temple of Edfu. The Romans, like the Ptolemies before them, maintained the Egyptian temples and supported the Egyptian priesthood, at least initially. Roman emperors were depicted on temple walls making offerings to Egyptian gods. Roman officials contributed to temple maintenance and construction, and the daily ritual at Edfu continued under Roman rule, apparently without significant interruption, for several more centuries. The continuity of the temple's operations under successive foreign rulers, first Ptolemaic, then Roman, is a testament to the institutional resilience of the Egyptian priesthood. The priests adapted to each new regime, accepted each new ruler, and incorporated each new king into the traditional ritual program. The theology was flexible enough to accommodate foreign rulers. The rituals were stable enough to survive changes of dynasty, and the temple, the physical building, with its inscriptions and its sanctuaries and its naos, provided the institutional continuity that individual rulers could not. Kings came and went. The temple endured, until it did not. The Christian closure of the 4th century ended the continuity that had persisted for 3 centuries under the Ptolemies and 3 more under the Romans. The 6 centuries of continuous operation, from the completion of the sanctuary to the final closure, were succeeded by 15 centuries of silence. And the silence was filled slowly and completely by sand. The sand that buried Edfu was not ordinary sand. It was Nile silt, the fine-grained alluvial material deposited by the annual Nile flood, mixed with wind-blown desert sand. The silt is rich in organic material and minerals, which gives it a cohesive quality that pure desert sand lacks. When compacted, by the weight of accumulated material, by the pressure of the houses built on top, the silt formed a dense, stable fill that supported the structures above while sealing the temple below. The fill was, in effect, a natural concrete, a self-cementing mixture of sand, silt, and organic material that hardened over time and created an airtight seal around the buried temple. This natural seal is what preserved Edfu. The seal prevented air from circulating through the interior chambers. Without air circulation, there was no moisture exchange, no salt crystallization, no chemical weathering, no biological growth. The temperature inside the sealed chambers remained stable, cool in summer, mild in winter, with minimal daily fluctuation. The painted surfaces, deprived of light, air, and moisture, experienced virtually no deterioration. The inscriptions, sealed from wind and rain, retained their sharp edges. The stone, protected from the thermal cycling that causes surface spalling, maintained its structural integrity. When Mariette broke the seal in the 1860s, the conditions inside the temple changed abruptly. The stable, sealed environment was replaced by the variable, open environment of the modern Nile Valley. Temperature fluctuations resumed. Moisture entered. Light reached surfaces that had been in darkness for 15 centuries. And the slow, steady deterioration that affects every exposed stone surface in Egypt began. The same deterioration that has been degrading the temples of Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, and every other ancient monument in the Nile Valley for centuries or millennia. The Temple of Edfu has been deteriorating since the day it was excavated, not rapidly, not dramatically, but measurably, continuously, irreversibly. The paint is fading, the edges are softening, the salts are crystallizing, the surfaces are losing the pristine condition that they had maintained in their sealed environment for 1,500 years. The excavations saved the temple from oblivion, but it also exposed it to destruction. The seal that preserved it was broken, and the breaking, however necessary, however justified, however productive of archaeological knowledge, was also the beginning of the end. The Temple of Edfu is the best preserved temple in Egypt, but it is less well preserved than it was in 1860, when Mariette first broke the seal, and it will be less well preserved in a century than it is today. The trajectory is downward. The direction is irreversible. And the best that conservation can do, the best that any human effort can achieve, is to slow the descent, to buy time, to preserve the knowledge before the stone that holds it crumbles, to read the walls before the walls become unreadable, to extract the information before the information is lost. The clock is running. The sand protected Edfu for 15 centuries. The air has been destroying it for 1.5. The math is striking. The ratio is 10 to 1. 15 centuries of protection for every 1.5 centuries of exposure. At that rate, Edfu has centuries of legibility left, but not millennia, not forever. And the urgency, the quiet, scholarly, methodical urgency of reading every inscription, translating every text, photographing every surface, and publishing every finding before the stone surrenders to the chemistry of time, is the defining quality of modern Edfu scholarship. The scholars are reading as fast as they can. The stone is fading as slowly as it can, and the race between the two, between the pace of scholarship and the pace of decay, is the race that will determine how much of the Temple of Edfu's knowledge survives into the future. The temple will stand for centuries more, the knowledge may not, and the gap between the two, between the durability of the building and the fragility of the information it contains, is the gap that the scholars of Edfu are racing to close. One inscription at a time, one translation at a time, one publication at a time, before the sand returns, before the silence deepens, before the best preserved temple in Egypt loses the very thing that makes it best, not its roof or its walls or its columns, but the 3,000 square meters of ancient text that make it, in the words of every scholar who has studied it, the most important library in stone in the history of the world. So what is the Temple of Edfu? It is the best preserved temple in Egypt, a Ptolemaic masterpiece, built between 237 and 57 BC, dedicated to the falcon god Horus, and surviving in a condition that is, by the standards of Egyptian archaeology, miraculous. It is the second largest temple in Egypt after Karnak, but the most complete, with its roof, its walls, its columns, its sanctuary, its naos, and its inscriptions all intact. It was buried by sand for 1.5 millennium, excavated by Mariette in the 1860s, and revealed to the modern world in a condition that has made it the single most important source for understanding how ancient Egyptian temples actually functioned. Its walls contain the instructions for the daily ritual. Its corridors contain the script for the world's oldest theatrical performance. Its laboratory contains the recipes for sacred incense. Its sanctuary contains the granite shrine that held the god, and its courtyard contains the memories of the Festival of the Beautiful Meeting, the annual celebration of the sacred marriage of Horus and Hathor, when the golden statue of the goddess was carried by boat from Dendera to Edfu, and the divine couple was reunited in the darkness of the sanctuary. The temple survived because of sand. The sand that buried it was the same sand that preserved it, sealing it from the elements, protecting it from the iconoclasts, insulating it from the earthquakes and floods and human depredations that destroyed every other temple in Egypt. The sand was not a deliberate act of preservation. It was an accident, a geologic, a climatic accident, a happy coincidence of wind patterns and topography that deposited enough material over enough centuries to encase the temple in a protective shell. The preservation was not planned, it was lucky, and the luck held for 1,500 years. The temple stands today in the center of the modern town of Edfu, surrounded by apartment buildings, shops, and streets that press against the ancient enclosure wall. The contrast between the ancient and the modern is stark. The 36-meter pylon rising above the rooftops of a provincial Upper Egyptian town, the carved reliefs of the courtyard visible from the windows of the neighboring buildings. The temple is an island of antiquity in a sea of modernity, and the sea is rising, the town is growing, the traffic is increasing, the environmental pressures on the monument are intensifying with each passing year. But the temple endures, as it has endured for 2,260 years, through the fall of the Ptolemies, through the Roman conquest, through the Christian closure, through the Islamic centuries, through the French expedition, through Mariette's excavation, through 2 world wars, through the construction of the Aswan Dam, through the transformation of Egypt from a kingdom to a republic, through every political, social, and cultural change that the Nile Valley has experienced in the 22 centuries since the first stone was laid. The temple endures because it was built well, because the sandstone is thick, because the foundations are deep, because the engineering is sound, because the proportions are correct, because the builders, working over 180 years, did not cut corners, did not use inferior materials, did not compromise on quality. They built a temple that was designed to last forever, and they came closer to achieving that goal than any other temple builders in the history of Egypt. The naos is still in the sanctuary, the inscriptions are still on the walls, the columns are still in the hypostyle halls, the pylon still stands, 36 meters tall, the tallest ancient gateway in Egypt, and the darkness, the specific dense architectural darkness of the sanctuary, still fills the innermost chamber, exactly as it filled it when the last priest sealed the shrine and walked away, 17 centuries ago, leaving the god alone in the dark. The god is still alone. The shrine is still empty. The ritual has not been performed for 1700 years, but the manual is still on the walls. The recipe for kifi is still in the laboratory. The script for the Festival of Victory is still in the corridor. Everything that would be needed to restart the temple, everything except the faith, is still there, still carved, still legible, still waiting. The sun rises over the Nile. The shadow of the pylon falls across the courtyard. The tourists gather at the entrance. The flashlights click on. And the Temple of Edfu, the best preserved temple in Egypt, the most complete record of ancient Egyptian religion, the building that was saved by sand and revealed by archaeology, opens its doors to another day, another morning, another cycle. The priest does not come, the ritual is not performed, the god is not fed, but the temple stands, the walls speak, and the darkness, in the sanctuary, holds its silence. The silence of a building that has outlived its purpose, that has outlasted its faith, that has preserved everything, except the one thing it was built to contain. The god is gone, the temple remains, and the temple, in its extraordinary completeness, is the most eloquent testimony to both, to the God who once lived there and to the world that has moved on. The best preserved temple in Egypt is also the most perfectly abandoned. The most completely intact is also the most completely emptied. And the paradox, preservation without purpose, completeness without content, is the final truth that Edfu teaches to anyone who stands in its sanctuary, in its darkness, beside its empty shrine, and listens to the silence of a building that has been waiting for 1700 years for someone to break the seal and wake the god. No one is coming. The seal will not be broken. The god will not wake. But the temple, the extraordinary, impossible, miraculous temple, endures.